This doesn't even include the problem that I haven't figured out or whatever that I have to figure out on the YouTube side that it actually records this, but it puts it somewhere that it's not accessible. So that's another whole thing I got to figure out because I discovered that it was recording it. It just was putting it in a place where this doesn't even include the problem that I haven't figured out or whatever that I have. There we go. Dulcet tones.
Was it you're looking for the recording locally on your computer?
No, no, no. It's on the YouTube account.
Just where it is there.
It's I figured it was there. It's not coming forward, and it had a notice on it that you have to take this little test. And I
Yeah.
did and passed it, but unfortunately, well, anyway.
Oh, like a CAPTCHA test?
Well, no, it's not a capture test. It was you have to take this little, prof it's like a little a remedial thing on what is supposed to be recorded and shown and not recorded and shown. What violates terms of
Uh,
service?
yeah, the disclaimer, like be on your
Yeah.
best behavior thing.
Well, what is legal? Is this legal? Is this legal? Is this legal? And, is this a violation of copyright or is it not? Or whatever. So,
Wow.
but I passed it, so, I don't know what the problem is now. I mean, it was a warning, and I assume Joe did something to alleviate
Let's
the warning and but did something else, and so that it keeps getting shuttled to this strange place that I can't bring back. Or, well, I'm not sure whether I can or can't. I haven't really done that yet. Um,
well, maybe we need to put some, some keywords like gun and shoot and stuff like that in.
Bomb. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, well, Antifa, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, how'd your demo go? Speaking of, Antifa.
Right. Yeah. My, my demo, yeah. It was well, yeah, last night there weren't as many people, but I was all charged up.
Okay, okay. Well, we're live actually, so yeah,
Okay.
don't say anything else. God, I think it two people to make a conspiracy, or is it three people? I can't
One
remember. I used to
one
know.
person
Well,
in their inner authoritarian.
well, you see, that's what AI can do. It can say, "Oh, there are enough people for a conspiracy." Anyway, all right, let me get on with this. Can you see this?
Yes,
Alrighty.
it's good.
Let me see if I can get the microphone because I'm only using. Well, let's see if I can get the better microphone hooked up. Testing one, two, three. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Alrighty. Let me just start this and okay, we're doing the last section maybe this weekend of chapter six of Marx's economic manuscript of 1864 to 65. Welcome to Weekly Marx. Yes, we've been plowing through this little translation done by Fowkes and Moseley with the editing by both. And we've been looking at the transformation of surplus profit into ground rent. Ground rent being the, kind of way in which we can sort of explain the difference between um, rent as having some connection, but not a great connection. That's why I've been doing this other stuff on subsumption, because you can sort of see the relationship between surplus profit and how subsumption operates to sort of explain why there's still some connection to labor, not labor explicitly, but labor as labor power. And I know that's a long way to tread. And going back to Marx's original writing is probably not necessarily the way to do it because it's kind of convoluted how he tries to explain how difference operates mathematically, and he does it arithmetically, which, does actually make sense if don't do any math higher than that, and but it's sort of a long way to go. So I took out some sections. Let me see if I can get to the spot. And I've taken segments out of it so we don't have to plow through his math. His math is not problematic. Let me just say that it's important to remember that Marx, um, is okay from the math side. And in fact, he was enough interested in math to, write a significant manuscript on calculus. So it's not like he doesn't know how to do the math. It's just simply that he wants to explain this in a way that is, I know we may not want to call it simple, but it's not, and it might not even be simple. But he wants to make it intelligible. As I've said before, capital can function, at least volume one. Capital can serve as a toolkit for the more open forms of discourse that are available from the pamphlet type texts. And it's not as intelligible simply because, Marx kept on saying, well, we're going to do this in volume whatever, one, two, three, four, five, six, and never got to it. And it was Engels' task to sort of work through that, which he did, but the reason why we're doing this is to sort of get back to some of the issues that Engels may have uh, neglected, but I don't even think he really neglected it. He just simply was trying to get to editing a fairly complex text. Now, so we're somewhere down close to that, and what we've been talking about is differential rent one and differential rent two. And the difference between the two is where capital improvements are. Are they on the land? Are they not on the land? And what is rent's relationship to it? And the point is, you have, imagine a four square ABCD plots of land of relatively equal proportion or size. And the overall thing that goes till the end of this chapter is to make some basic analytic comparisons. That is, either you have two plots of land in the same country, each with four squares, and you compare them, or you compare them in different countries. And the whole underlying point of this exercise is to say, well, with all the math being relatively okay, you can see that there's a certain moment that relies on the variable thing, the true variable thing relative to quote unquote the ground or land relative to rent, and that is fertility. So ultimately, it's all about fertility. I mean, that's why, or this is one way of explaining um, why Marx was interested in Liebig's work on soil chemistry, soil science, so that you could identify or measure soil fertility better. And of course, Marx is not a chemist. He relies a great deal on Liebig, and so this is a kind of a way of talking about it so that you can say, okay, the math sort of is okay, but the one variable in, trying to calculate all this sort of stuff without going to empirical studies, which he intends on doing in the historical section. And, that's for another discussion. That is the so-called volume four, which is disclaimed by people like Heinrich. But there's stuff there. And a side academic project might be to ask the question, what was the Soviet understanding during farm collectivization in the 20s and 30s of volume three? Did they even know about volume three? I mean, did they even imagine what I mean, did they get to it? Did they read Engels? Were they reading Engels? Was Lysenko reading Engels? Um, that though, and volume three of Marx of Capital, and it's sort of interesting. These are interesting questions, not profound ones, but I don't read Russian, so and I don't read German very well, so that's kind of where we are. So we come. That all being said, to get to the end of this section, he's been talking about two forms of differential rent, one and two. Given a constant production and constant differences, the average rent per acre may rise with the total rental in case of differential one, and so may the average rate of rent on capital. But the average is merely an abstraction. The actual level of rent per acre or reckoned on capital remains the same under these assumptions. Under the same assumptions, however, the level of rent measured per acre may rise, although the rate of rent measured on the capital laid out remains the same. So, without getting into this too far, he's looking at level of rent versus rate of rent, and so we're looking at different numbers. And I'm trying to compress, we now proceed to show the result, the combinations of differential rent 2, which does, however, presuppose as its basis differential rent 1. A, constant price of production. This implies that the market price continues to be governed by the capital invested on the worst land, A. If the additional capital invested on any of the rent-bearing types of land, B, C, and D of our quadrant is only as productive as the same capital on land A, i.e., if at the governing price of production, it yields only the average profit and thus no surplus profit, the effect on rent is zero. Everything remains as it was before. It is the same as if a number of acres of quality A, the worst land, had been added to the area previously cultivated. Number two, on each different type of land, additional capitals produce extra products in proportion to their size, i.e., the volume of production grows according to the specific fertility of each type of land in proportion to the amount of extra capital. So this is how difference pivots. It pivots on capital, doesn't pivot on land. And that's kind of the essential thing. And yes, there's a lot of yak going on and a lot of numbers and tables and stuff. And it's fine. It's just that he wants to remind us that it's about difference and not necessarily about the, sums or whatever. But the law is, and this is where the idea of trying to generalize from this, and if, you are reminded of my yakking about subsumption, this is where, the universal becomes particular and not necessarily singular, but it does, there is a kind of winnowing down in the dialectic. But the law is that the rent on these types of land grows absolutely, even if not in proportion to the additional capital invested. If the rate of decline of the surplus product is given, the rent increases on a piece of land in proportion to the quantity of capital successfully invested, the quantity of excess capital. If the amount of capital is given, the rent declines in proportion to the rate of decline in the productivity of the excess capital. Page 506 in the manuscript, the rate of surplus profit declines in relation both to the extra capital and the total capital invested on the land, but the absolute amount of surplus profit increases just as the falling rate of profit on capital in general is usually combined with an increasing absolute mass of profit. The average surplus profit for the capital investment on B, for example, is now 90% on the capital, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there's a lot of arm waving here. And it all has relevance. He's just going at it, section by section. And I've tried to cull out where it kind of makes a sort of summary point. Hence, in two countries where production prices are identical and the differences between land types are also identical, and the same amount of capital is invested, but in one country, remember, he's making this kind of analogy. Well, is it about the two quadrants next to each other, or is it about the countries separated, operating? And ultimately, he's going to make a comment, of course, on colonization, because that's the issue, or at least one of the underlying issues. So, hence, in two countries where production prices are identical and differences between land types are also identical, and the same amount of capital is invested, but in one country. This happens more in the form of successive investments on the same land, and in the other country, more in the form of parallel and coordinated investments on a greater amount of land, the rent per acre, and therefore the price of land would be higher in the first country and lower in the second, even though the total rental in both countries was the same. I think that's sort of the key point. The difference in levels of rent could thus be explained neither in terms of a difference in the natural fertility of the land types, nor in the amount of labor applied, but exclusively in terms of the different kinds of capital investment, which is sort of his point. Um, is to look at how rent is affected by the way in which you apply capital. And its relationship to the land is different because the land is fixed, has constraints or boundaries or something. And that's kind of what's at work. And so, yes, there's a lot of yammering going on and a lot of tables. And he makes a comparison between corn rent and money rent. And the point he's trying to make, of course, is that in as commodities, they're not identical. That wheat, it's perishable, etc., and money's not so much. The money has other issues, and they are commodities. It's just that the difference in commodities, which he, has been spending his time figuring out, is why, one thing is more generalizable and the other thing is not so generalizable, but it's not problematic. It's just simply that you have to have the kind of language to talk about it. And I think that's Marx's attempt to work through this capital question on the back of or in response to, classical political economy. And he spends a lot of time doing this, but this is why people still refer to volume three, is that, he's still working through this problem. And I would assert that from an empirical point of view, that, he keeps kicking it down the road. Um, that, oh, well, when we look at the history of this, it'll all become clear. And he never gets to it, sort of. So the land bearing less rent than the land bearing blah, blah, blah. This is simply for the following reason. In order for the money rent to remain the same or to rise, a definite additional quantity of surplus product must be produced, and the greater the fertility of the lands yielding surplus product, the less capital this requires. If the differences between B and C, remember this is quadrant B, A, B, C, D, and C and D were still greater, still less extra capital would be needed. The specific proportions depends, number one, on the ratio in which the price falls, thus on the differences between B and A, noting that, of course, that A is problematic relative to fertility. And number two, on the ratio of the differences between the better types of land from B upwards. And three, on the amount of extra capital invested on the land. So he's going very systematically here. Eventually, he's going to make a reference to how um, other forms of capital or capitals are, related to this development, and ultimately to the question that surplus is sort of tied to the land, but more as a kind of abstract relation, a kind of proxy. So I know this is inferential, but I would say that that's kind of where he was headed, and in terms of the development of discussing financial and merchant capital. So ultimately, I think that's where he's headed. But he wants to work through this because he's kind of a little obsessive about this matter. But that's the kind of task here, is that we're translating all of this. Okay. It is clear, on the other hand, that this average capital investment, for example, £8 per acre in England before 1848 and £12 per acre after 1848, is what provides the standard when rent contracts are drawn up. For the farmer who spends more than this, the surplus profit is not transformed into rent. Now, whether this happens when the lease expires will depend on the competition of those farmers who are in a position to make the same extra outlay. We're not referring here to lasting improvements to the land. This is that Ricardian question, which continue to provide an increased product with the same outlay of capital or even a declining outlay. So although these are the product of capital, they function just like natural differences in the quality of the soil. We can see, therefore, that differential rent 2 involves an element that does not develop as such in the case of differential rent 1, since this can persist independently of any change in the normal capital investment per acre. On the one hand, the results of different capital investments on land type A are blurred, their product appearing as an average product per acre. On the other hand, there is a change in the normal minimum or the average quantity of capital outlays per acre, so that this change appears as a property of the soil. Because I think this change appears as a property of the soil is actually kind of important. Finally, there is a distinction in the way the surplus profit is transformed into the form of rent. So this is kind of what he's driving at. So that's why I identified that as an important thing there. And then, he makes comments on improvements in productivity. So what has been proved in any case is that when the production price falls as a result of a rise in surplus productivity, resulting in turn from an increase in capital investment, i.e., as soon as this productivity grows in a higher ratio than the capital itself increases, the rent per acre for a capital investment of double the quantity might not just double per acre, but more than double. And this is the same point he makes with capital that is not related to land. And he makes this is kind of a structurally similar point that he makes to surplus value relative to labor. So it kind of is consonant with that. It's just that I wish that he'd, kind of make it clear, but he really does want to go through all these numbers. And so he does. The money rent would rise under these conditions if, provided the proportionate impact of the additional capital was the same on each of the different types of land, the amount of capital had more than doubled and was concentrated more on the better than the inferior types of land, or if the additional fertility magnified the differences between the different types. So that's kind of where he is now. He's going, okay, all the numbers sort of work, but the kind of variable that I need to sort of work in a much larger empirical sense is this problem of fertility. So that's kind of what he implies. The money rent finally would rise given the same proportionate rise in fertility. If given the same proportionate rise in fertility, more additional capital is applied to the better lands than to A. That's, I've been, it sort of repeats himself. Or if the additional capital investments on the better lands acted with an increased productivity, in both cases, the differences would grow. Thus, the money rent always remains the same with falling production prices as a result of increased fertility with increased capital investment. If the additional capital is distributed evenly among the types of land of different fertility, and the investment itself acts proportionately on the different types of land according to the commercial difference between them, the corn rent rises. For the money rent, it is the same if the capital investments on the different types of land had increased proportionately while the prices remained unchanged. So you can sort of see he's kind of working kind of ceteris paribus here, and that's fine. That Marx is thinking obviously in a micro or comparative statics sort of way. And so what we have here is an attempt to yak about this. And I'm just going to pull this out of this section here, but it is about the rising price of production. Rent should be discussed under the following headings. So in other words, he's talking about rent as a kind of special case relative to production prices. So A1, the concept of differential rent as such, that the example of water power, then the transition to agricultural rent proper. Now, the point of the use of water power here is, you're kind of locationally fixed here. So that's obviously, we're in this Ricardian thing. And A2, differential rent 1, rising from the varying fertility of different tracts of land, which is what we've been discussing, and differential rent 2, arising from you see, you could apply capital to differential rent one, but differential rent two focuses on, winnows it down, narrows it down to what happens to the capital investments and what are the other elements that are part of this. And, I think they could be solved with all due respect relative to calculus, et cetera. But, he didn't quite get there. So, differential rent two arising from the successive capital investments on the same land. This should be divided further into a differential rent with the price of production stationary, differential rent with the price of production falling, and differential rent with the price of production rising. You can see how he wants to do this. And D, which is the key thing, because this goes back to the issue, and without getting too crazy about it, to what we were talking about in subsumption, and that is the relationship of surplus labor to surplus profit, and then in this instance, the transformation of surplus profit into rent. The influence of, and lest you think that that's unimportant, that this distinction is actually fairly important when we get, more to stuff in financial and merchant capital. The influence of this rent on the rate, A4 is the influence of this rent on the rate of profit, and then B is absolute rent, C is the price of land, and D, final considerations on ground rent. And so, we now have the following general results from considering differential rent as a whole. Firstly, the formation of surplus profits can occur in various ways. It can occur on the basis of differential rent one, i.e., on the basis of the investment of the total agricultural capital on an acreage consisting of types of land of differing fertility. Ricardo, on the variation in the surplus productivity of successive capital investments on the same land. What is meant here by surplus productivity is greater productivity, for example, in quarters of wheat, than the same capital investment produces on the worst type of land A, although the worst type of land is not to be taken as the worst type of land altogether, but the land that governs the price of production. So we're talking indexically in some ways. Anyway, the transformation of surplus profits into rent, hence their transfer from farmer to proprietor, always presupposes its initial condition that the various actual individual prices of production, i.e., those which were independent of the general production price that governs the market price, which the partial products of the individual successive capital investments are equalized in advance to give an individual average price of production. This is where he's beginning to think now, and this is where I would expect those planners of the Soviet variety were thinking about in terms of trying to think of this more in, well, they weren't thinking of it in matrix terms, but you can see where this could go and where it doesn't necessarily apply to agriculture. But anyway, the excess of this general production price of the product of an acre over the individual average production price forms and measures the rent per acre. In the case of differential rent one, the differential results can be distinguished in and for themselves because they take place on different areas of land, outside and alongside one another, given a capital outlay per acre that is taken as normal and the normal cultivation corresponding to it. In the case of differential rent 2, they must first be made distinguishable. They must, in fact, be transformed back into differential rent 1, and this can be only done in the manner indicated. And then this gets busy down here, and we get lost. But, he's kind of working through this. Secondly, given a declining surplus productivity, the extra capital investments, whose minimum limit as far as the formation of new surplus profit is concerned, is the capital investment that simply covers the production costs. You see, he's just drilling down. He's trying to get there. And that total investment on an acre of B would form no more rent than to which the total investment on an acre, no more rent is that to which the individual average production price of the product per quarter would fall on the better land below the production price on land A. And it just, yeah, he goes through this. It gets a little busy down here. So, and yes, he tries, it just gets uglier and uglier. Although, I suppose if I were teaching high school or something, I'd actually get them to do all the math or to build the table and do the stuff and learn how to use an Excel spreadsheet. As I've said before, uh, uh, if just Marx could have had a computer and Excel on it, maybe things would be different. But anyway, um, we yammer further on here, and he makes all these. Essentially, what he's doing is talking about the sequence of events, a circulatory approach to production that that was explained to great detail in volume 2. So, thus, although the differential rent is only a formal transformation of surplus profit into rent, which simply enables the landowner to transfer the surplus profit from the farmer to himself, it becomes plain that the successive employment of capital on the same soil, or what comes to the same thing, the increase of the capital employed upon the same soil tends rather to find its limit in this transference given a declining rate of productivity and a constant production price. In fact, it comes up against a more or less artificial barrier, a result of the merely formal transformation of surplus profit into ground rent, which is a consequence of landed property. This is, he probably should have said this at the beginning. Well, he sort of does. And the point he's obviously making is the same one that we were looking at in subsumption, and that is, the fact that landed property is that kind of weird thing that you know um it, it prevents productivity in some ways. It also is exploitative in other ways, and that's kind of the point he wants to make. And I know he went a long way to get there, but I think it proves out, and a person reading this and sort of doing all the arithmetic would sort of see, okay, this is where it sort of works and doesn't work, and where, you have problematic variables. And he's already set them in there. I mean, he says, fertility differences, etc. So, all the things are there. The rise in the general price of production, which becomes necessary here, where the limit is narrower than elsewhere, is in this case not, therefore, not only the basis for the rise in differential rent. In addition to this, the the existence of differential rent as rent is at the same time the basis for the rise in the price of production and for the need for an earlier and more rapid rise in the latter in order to guarantee the supply of the surplus product. So we're beginning to see where he was going relative to understanding calculus. So, and blah, blah, blah. So I've just said that, and that's what I culled out of that. Um, and there's more math. We've dealt with the first way in which rent can arise on the poorest land, A, without bringing into cultivation still worse land, namely in the way in which it originates from the difference between its individual price of production, which was formerly the governing one, and the new higher price of production, at which the extra bit of extra capital supplies the extra product needed on better soil, but with deficient productivity. So he's looking at this kind of difference, this gap difference, which has a similar quality to the logic of his surplus value argument that he makes in terms of labor, of surplus labor. So it's kind of there. The structural thing is going on here, and it's not identical because he's trying to deal with this other issue of fertility. Although you could see that if you wanted to shift value questions to fertility of women, for example, it would be sort of an interesting problem. But I think this is made in at least one part of feminist literature on this, feminist economics literature on this point, but I'm not as well versed in that. From the standpoint of the capitalist mode of production, there's always a relative increase in the price of products if, in order to obtain the same product, an outlay must be made that was previously unnecessary. And this necessity thing is actually kind of important. But anyway, for the replacement of capital consumed in the course of production does not simply mean that the replacement of values expressed in a particular means of production. Natural elements which go into production as agents without costing anything, whatever role they might play in production, do not go in as components, et cetera, et cetera. and of capital, but rather as a free natural power of capital, i.e., a free natural power of labor. You see, this is where it comes back. If a natural power of this kind, therefore, which originally costs nothing, has to be replaced by human labor, by human activity in the further course of production, a new and additional element goes into the capital. This is this whole business about that ultimately will become, the problematic human capital argument, which is interesting, problematic. Nobel Prizes went out, but this concept, is kind of 19th century. It's not, I'm not going to take Gary Becker's Nobel away from him, but I mean, it's still sort of there. A relatively greater capital investment is thus needed in order to obtain the same product. All other circumstances remaining the same, ceteris paribus, production becomes more expensive, and so we get to, and I managed to plow through 40 pages of yammering to essentially get to the table, which I put in at the beginning of this entire mess to describe to you the different examples and ultimately the discourse that has arisen um, in sort of the so-called new interpretation of Marx that comes after sort of the reevaluation of all the orthodox stuff. So there's a lengthy history in the heterodox literature that discusses these differences. So you have three columns: differential forms, description, and examples. The examples are obviously the most important point from a pedagogical point of view. So you have differential rent one, rent arising from increases in productivity. This is what Marx has been talking about, right? Increases in productivity due to some feature of the land. See, the land features are the whole deal here. It's sort of the, defining quality and problematic because of fertility, etc. So classic example of differential rent one is fertility of the soil. Modern example, now this is the important point for those of us who are kind of obsessed with this problem. Fertility of the soil can be compared to, and it's problematic and for a whole bunch of other reasons. The modern example is distance from workplace market as per the Alonzo-Muth model, which the problem with the Alonzo-Muth model, or without going into a long lecture on it, is that it's a center periphery model with that tends to overlimit. You have to start looking at things as sort of cells, and then you sort of over determine the fact that you're kind of abstracting over usually a differentiated plane, and that's where the problem becomes. Do you use more resources in order to get stuff up and down hills and around mountains and other stuff? Of course, if you have a relatively flat central business district, your Alonzo-Muth model works kind of okay. And in suburban terms, that's kind of, well, you can sort of calculate it. And then, obviously when other demographic things step in, you have a failed, failed shopping centers. But anyway, differential rent two. The description is rent arising from increases in productivity as a result of investment on the land. So, you know, it 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 is about strip malls also. Ultimately, empirically, you could say, well, differential rent too is a little bit more about strip malls and also about, freeways and roads and road network and utilities and a bunch of other stuff. Classic example is investment in improving the fertility of the soil. This is, the Ricardian thing is that let's say you have, four plots of land and, you do this little experiment on it and you estimate what, see in the Ricardian example, the quadrant A is in the medieval sense, it's the fallow land, right? It's the land you kind of leave beside you during the, cycling of property, of growing plots. So investment improving the fertility of the soil comes in various ways, right? You either plop capital onto the site, which is an interesting question whether which type of site you plop the equipment on or the capital on, the constant capital on. So whether it's a building or something which more like a combine, there's a big difference. All right. Anyway, the modern example, which is a good example and is kind of a standard in city planning, is a shopping mall which invests in facilities and services to ensure that its tenants receive greater custom, right? You can do this, and it seems a little tedious, but the fact is it can be done with great precision relative to certain constants. Where's the freeway, where's et cetera, et cetera, where's all the infrastructure. So this is the way in which you describe, in a more modern sense, the difference from the Ricardian, from the classical examples that Marx is trying to get at in order to administer his critique of classical political economy. Now, the issue that comes up, and the one that's taken on further in the contemporary sense, because this is more interesting, also more problematic, and also ones that have great empirical import, and particularly for like Baran and Sweezy. So you're looking at monopoly rents, which is sort of the whole point of the late 19th century, early 20th century, is to try and figure out, well, why are things, problematic? Why do we have so many panics? Why is it? Because, whether there is cartelization and monopolization and oligopolies and blah, blah, blah. And what does that mean? The state should come in and try and straighten this out, at least because, some things are, and my point about this is the problem of predation. And we don't need to go very far to see how predatory behavior is occurring in the current context, but let's go through this. Monopoly rent. You see, rents are always part of this problem, regardless of whether you're talking about land and ground rent or additional above ground rents, which is the kind of the whole business about skyscrapers and stuff. A rent arising from some unique, non-substitutable feature of the commodity, which is, as such, limited only by effective demand. And that's Moseley's bit here, is that, effective demand is a real problem, and measuring it in reasonable ways is problematic only because, it's a scale problem. You need to figure out, well, okay, how is it that we calculate aggregate demand and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, classic example, and this is the differential rent problem in a slightly different way, and it is really problematized by time relative to, you know, uh, vineyards and, how much you blend your wine and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, fine wine from a particular vineyard, that's the classical example, and it is mentioned by even Ricardo, I think, or Smith. Anyway, the modern example, which is more interesting, is the toll road that is the only route. And not like let's see, what is it? The loans I think that are being made to Argentina have a similar element to it. Anyway, or the sale of a Picasso painting. And so David Harvey is clearly about this problem. He takes on this in that way and is worth looking at. Now, absolute rent, which is what Basu doesn't, tries to work through because it's, some of it doesn't work structurally for what he wants to do, for example, in India. But anyway, absolute rent is, as described, a rent arising because of the existence of a class of landlords acting as a barrier to entry for capital or consumer. And this can take the form of a reservation price, which keeps land out of supply, made more problematic, of course, by other variables, only certain land goes to people of a certain color, blah, blah, blah. And concerted cartel-like action amongst landowners in order to circumscribe competition and or exploit consumers. So there's all kinds of stuff going on there, right? Worth studying. Now, the classic example for absolute rent is the class of landlords preventing the entry of capital into the agricultural industry, although you can extrapolate, and so preventing the equalization of the profit rates, maintaining higher rents as a result. This is the point that Marx is making about, rent being this other way of measuring this other kind of capital requirement that begins to emerge. Anyway, the modern example, one, housing, which the landlord keeps vacant rather than rent out at a loss. And what's his name? Walker looks at this, and I think that's a worthy question from a geographer or a city planner's point of view. And we see many examples of this. And we see the inverse of that, of course, in that uh, I think and it's predatory in the sense that I think the Saudis own at least one floor, maybe a couple in Trump Tower, for example, as do Russians, um, which sort of explains other stuff going on. But anyway, that's another story. Number two, protection, creation of a monopoly through litigation, mhm, lawfare, despite substitutability otherwise. That is, i.e., brand protection of wine from the Champagne region of France. And, Harvey discusses this because it's a big deal. I mean, and foie gras has the same problem, for example, but I think Champagne, and then there's some cheeses that have this issue. But anyway, so that's why there's sparkling wine from California that is never called Champagne, even though it is de facto. But there's legal issues if you put it on your label. So there's that. Now, what I did was I added Basu's paper because he sort of does the more, updated version of this exact thing. It's an elaboration of Marx in volume three of Capital. And so, he creates these kind of closures on the model that defines surplus profit and rent. This discusses the three components of rent, highlights the condition for the existence of rent, which is what Marx is doing. And then a second closure of the model extends Marx's analysis by explicitly incorporating the role of demand. Remember, I talked about demand and profit maximizing behavior of capitalist farmers. Now, this gets into the weeds a little because I think Basu's research and his graduate students, I think, are more interested in that kind of issue relative to agriculture in India. Um, so this is a useful article. Um, Marx's theory of rent, Dipankar Basu at UMass, and it's just interesting. I think it is. Hence, I emphasize the Marxist theory that can explain rent in any system of capitalist commodity production which uses privately owned, non-reproducible resources. This is where it's agriculture, right? But it's applicable far beyond the domain of agriculture and can be used for analysis of rent in other sectors like, among others, the same things that Marx is talking about, mines, right? Although in this case, oil and natural gas, and then real estate as well. So all of these are useful and still worth working on, even in the current context. So I think I've gotten to the end of my yammering without trying to plow through. What I did was I included the introduction to the Basu article and the conclusion, but there's a lot of math in there. So it's not problematic math. It's actually quite, recent math and useful for all the usual reasons. It has a micro uh, foundational element in it. So it's useful in all these terms. And if you look at Basu's, I think he's got at least one or two graduate students working through the Indian side of this. And so that's kind of all interesting. And I hope you have a chance to look at it. I've used up my time despite my little earlier technical problems, which seem inexplicable. But anyway, I apologize for that. Um, and let me thank you for your attention. And so I'm going to go, let's see, come on, stop the live share.